In this room today, whether it's parent, student, or teacher, we are all bound by being part of the UWC mission. And we could say that we are some of those nations and cultures that have been brought together in a bid to foster peace and a sustainable future. The experience began not here, but at UWC Atlantic College, that castle in South Wales that about 50-odd years ago began this movement with a mission. And I'm well aware of the irony of speaking on the subject of beyond UWC, when from Atlantic to SEA, from student to teacher, I have not gone beyond UWC at all. But it was those 2 years that had such a profound experience on me, those nations and those cultures, that it led me back to UWC to become a part of other people's experiences. When we were at Atlantic College, we often spoke about how we felt like we were tasked with saving the world. A little idealistic, I know, but we were all aware that we had been given a scholarship, someone had selected us, invested in us, all in the hope that we would be a force for positive change in the world. This felt like a lot of responsibility. Some of you in this room may be feeling the weight of that responsibility right now. And some of you in this room may be wondering just what I'm talking about. If you've been on public transport recently, you will have heard some version of the message, see something, say something. Yet this is something that many of us find hard. And I actually think that's a fundamental part of the responsibility of being part of the UWC movement. And I learned something very important about that just a couple years before I went to Atlantic College. In my last few years of high school, I was quite badly bullied. You wouldn't tell from this picture, and actually it came as quite the surprise to me too. I thought I had done everything that would offer me immunity. I was part of a varsity sports team, I did drama inside and outside of school, and most importantly for an all-girls school, I knew boys. But it didn't work. At my school, a high-pressure academic girls' school, people were quite often cast out of their friendship groups, the remaining members feeling more valued, more superior, and more included. Usually this was quite temporary. The offending member would just keep their head down until someone else committed a perceived infraction and was cast out. And I think it was the surprise that it was me that initiated my reaction. When my turn came around, I spoke out. I was worried. I called out my friends for bullying. Now, see, the thing is, I was well aware that other people had a tough time at school, but I thought that as long as I wasn't a part of it, it had nothing to do with me, until it was me. And on speaking out, I learnt my first important lesson during this scenario. Most people like to think that they are good people, and do not take kindly to the suggestion that this might not be true. And so, in a bid to protect themselves, the girls pushed back, and things got a lot worse for me. I knew that by sticking to my guns, I was walking straight into further difficulty. But this did two important things for me. Firstly, it gave me a reason to go and find a community that better represented my ideals, which is how I ended up at Atlantic College. But more importantly, by speaking up and making some noise, I forced the school to acknowledge me, and therefore the problem. You see, psychological bullying is actually a relatively invisible problem, and as long as the grades were good and nothing looked wrong, the school wasn't going to do anything about it until someone spoke up. And that person happened to be me. But the most important thing I learned was that I should have done it long before. I could have saved myself and others a lot of pain if I'd spoken up when I was part of that inner circle, before it was me. Globally, we are part of that inner circle, and it is our responsibility to speak up for others, even when it is nothing to do with us, and especially when it actually is something to do with us. You see, this is our mission statement. We have all committed to being a force to foster peace and a sustainable future. And if we're going to speak up on the behalf of peace, then we need to be very sure what violence looks like. Norwegian sociologist and founder of peace and conflict studies, Johan Galtung, defines violence as thus: it is the difference between the potential and the actual. So it's the difference between what someone's life should look like and what it actually does. That means anything that creates that gap, whether it's war, famine, or unequal pay, or a lack of access to opportunities, anything that perpetuates that gap can be considered violence. All inequality, therefore, is violence. So all we have to do, in order to foster peace, therefore, is learn to look past our own lives and recognize that gap when it exists for someone else. People outside of our community, people inside of our community, and most importantly, when our community is the one that's creating that gap for someone else. As I found out at school, this can often make people uncomfortable. None of us like people pointing out our flaws. It's just human nature. People will push back. People will respond angrily. So what we have to do is become comfortable with being uncomfortable. Just by speaking up, by making noise, by rocking the boat, we might become the agitators. We might find ourselves causing conflict. But the important thing to remember is conflict is not the same as violence. Conflict is natural. Conflict is normal. It's just a difference in goals. Everyone perceives the world in a different way. And until conflict stops someone from reaching their potential, until it becomes violence, then we have to learn to work with it. Conflict is normal. Violence is not. Before I figured this all out, I was 18, I was leaving Atlantic College, I felt the weight of the mission statement on my shoulders, and I was wondering and worrying about how I was going to save the world. I realize now, of course, that this phrase comes with more than a touch of arrogance. And it was from my grandmother that I learned that the savior image, that self-promotion, has nothing to do with being of value in the world. It is not necessary, and it is not helpful. All you have to do is find a way to be useful, and then just work hard at being really, really useful. This is how my grandmother became a leading educator. She was principal of 2 leading colleges of nursing and a professor in her field. She was an inspiration to hundreds who spend every day in a caring profession. She became a nurse simply because she cared, because she found a way to contribute. She didn't look ahead and look for those positions. She just found a way of being really, really useful. Suddenly, finding a way to be useful and doing a good job of it seems like a pretty effective way of changing the world. And it was my grandmother that told me that I should find something I truly love doing. And just find something where at the end of the day, you feel like your day was worth doing. And I'm really glad I followed that advice, because it's why I'm a teacher now, doing something that I love doing and doing something that I genuinely think is worthwhile. And it was in the last few weeks of my teacher training when I received a phone call from my mother in India, informing me that my grandmother had passed away. Alone in my house in Oxford, and just a few weeks away from a flight ticket to see her, I considered how I was going to deal with this news. I had a 5,000-word essay due the next day. It was the last essay of my teaching qualification, and I knew that I could push the deadline, but the thought crossed my mind that my professor grandmother, who published a textbook aged 82, would not be impressed if I had used her death as an excuse to miss a deadline. Nani did not miss deadlines, and it was most certainly not on her account that I was going to miss one of mine. So I gathered myself, got on my bike, and I went to the library. I received the highest mark I've ever received in an academic piece of work for that essay. And it was not because the spirit of my grandmother was magically spurring me on. It was because I was almost done when I got to the library. My grandmother's words, "fail to plan, plan to fail," are forever etched in my mind. As a nursing administrator, those were some of her most valuable pieces of advice, and some of the most freely given. But actually, it was from her example that I learned that those things apply to doing an essay and planning your pension and doing your job properly, but not necessarily to your whole life. You don't have to have it mapped out in front of you. You just need to find a place where you can be of use. And where you might end up, or where it might take you, is really of less consequence than the fact that you are contributing positively to the world around you. This is how my grandmother became the only Professor Emeritus ever to come out of India in her field. This is how she became a leading educator and inspired of hundreds of nurses who, as I said, are spending every single day in a caring profession. After my grandmother died, my brother and I would often talk about how proud she had been of her life. She would tell stories about the things that she had done, the things that she had seen. She had been a giant in her field, and she was deservedly proud. But to those who knew her, my grandmother was not considered to be an ambitious woman. She never sought responsibility out of a sense of prestige or a sense of self-promotion. It's just that when she had a job to do, she made sure it was done impeccably. So people kept giving her jobs to do. And this is how she cracked glass ceilings. This is how she became the first woman on a board of governors of a leading school in India. And it wasn't just in her professional life. Her inclination to improve things led her to push boundaries in her personal life, outside her professional life too. When my aunt and my mother were little girls, my feminist grandmother decided that they too should be allowed to sing in the then all-boys cathedral choir. It's probably the reason that St. Thomas's Cathedral in Mumbai has a mixed choir to this day. It was from her example that I learned that you can push the boundaries, both professionally and in your community, by following 3 simple principles. First, find a way to be useful. And whatever you are doing, do it to the best of your abilities. If you find an opportunity to challenge the status quo, speak out and speak up. And always take care of others. If we all followed these 3 pieces of advice, we too might just be able to change the world. So here I am at Atlantic College with my grandmother, and in answer to 18-year-old me, wondering and worrying about how to change the world. I should have stopped worrying about doing it all on my own. All of us in this room, if we went out and just found a way to be useful, but every single day, and we committed to that, imagine the mammoth impact we could have. And all we need to do is find the smallest way to be of use. And then nobody need worry about becoming the next UN Secretary General or about becoming the president of their country. Somebody's already on that. And if that's you, then that's great. And if it's not, don't sweat it. Just find something that you love doing and do it well. As a student and a teacher of literature, I fundamentally believe that we can learn a lot from sharing and telling stories. But just in case the point of all this has been lost in the narratives, let me remind you. You don't have to set out to change the world to find yourself changing it. All you have to do is find a way to be of use. It's really easy to be useful if you find a way to care about others. And part of caring about others is the responsibility to identify violence as violence. And in doing so, you might sometimes lead to conflict. And so we must become comfortable with being uncomfortable. There's a million things in the world that need improving. But there's also well over 1 million people to improve them. If we all took that commitment seriously, we could do some amazing things. And this, to me, is the simplest way I could think of explaining what it means to go beyond UWC. Thank you for listening.